before electricity lit the streets of American cities, before law stretched its long arm into every corner of the continent, there was a place, raw, vast, and merciless, the American Old West, a frontier so violent, so lawless, that ordinary men became myths, and myths became monsters. Historians have written their names into legend, but what they've never told you is just how far the darkness truly went. We've ranked them. 15 of the most lethal, most feared, most dangerous souls to ever ride the frontier. But stay until number 1, because one man on this list may have killed more than 40 people, and even Wild Bill Hickok chose not to face him. And if you're into history, the kind they don't teach in schools, subscribe to history through pictures. This is the countdown. Number 15, Clay Allison. They called him the gentleman gunfighter, and like most gentlemen of the Old West, he was anything but. Robert Clay Allison drifted west after the Civil War, settled into the cattle trade in New Mexico, and built a reputation on a peculiar code. He refused to shoot a man who hadn't earned it. He gave fair warning. He made the terms clear. And then he was faster, calmer, and colder than anyone standing across from him. His defining confrontation came in 1875. A gunman named Chunk Colbert challenged him to a duel. The two men sat down to dinner first, and it was at that table that Colbert reached for his weapon mid-meal. Allison was quicker. When asked later why he had eaten with a man he knew wanted him dead, Allison said he didn't want to send a man to hell on an empty stomach. The irony of his death is that it had nothing to do with a gun. In 1887, a wagon wheel slipped, and the frontier's most courteous killer died in the road without firing a shot. But if Clay Allison was the gentleman of this list, the outlaw at number 14 had no such pretensions. Number 14, Belle Starr. She was called the Bandit Queen of the West, and she earned it. Myra Maybelle Shirley grew up watching the border wars shred the fabric of her community. She drifted into the outlaw world through Jesse James, the younger brothers, men whose company was itself a form of criminal credential. She married twice, both times to outlaws. She ran a ranch in Indian Territory that functioned as a known shelter for fugitives. She rode side saddle in velvet, carrying 2 pistols, in a time when women were expected to be invisible. In 1883, she became one of the first women convicted of a major crime in U.S. federal court. She served her time and returned without apparent regret. The twist is her death. In February 1889, 2 days before her 41st birthday, Belle Starr was shot in the back from ambush, hit twice with a shotgun. She died in the road. The killer was never identified. The bandit queen who had ridden so boldly through a man's world was killed by an unknown hand, in the dark, without warning. That mystery has never been solved. Number 13, Bill Longley. If Belle Starr died by ambush, Bill Longley lived by it. William Preston Longley grew up in post-war Texas, a world burning with resentment and fury. He killed his first man at 15. He killed during robberies, during arguments. He reportedly killed a preacher. He was captured, escaped, hunted, and captured again. His defining crime came in 1877. He shot and killed a man named Wilson Anderson over a land dispute so thin and petty that even the frontier press called it senseless. He was brought to trial in Giddings, Texas, and hanged in 1878. But here is what history tends to leave out. The drop failed to break his neck. Witnesses said he strangled slowly for 11 minutes before death came. A man who had spent a lifetime dealing instant death spent his final 11 minutes unable to escape it. The outlaw at number 12 was no less brutal, but far harder to catch. Number 12, Billy Brooks. Here is a name most people have never heard. William L. Brooks, known as Billy Brooks, operated in the cattle towns of Kansas in the early 1870s. He served as a lawman. He also robbed stagecoaches. He worked both sides of the law with a flexibility that the frontier sometimes permitted. In a single month in Ellsworth, Kansas, in 1872, Brooks was reported to have killed or wounded at least a dozen men. The local paper wrote of him as something closer to a natural disaster than a man. His speed with a pistol was, by the account of those who survived encounters with it, exceptional, faster than men who are far better remembered today. He was captured in 1874 and lynched by a vigilante mob in Caldwell, Kansas. The precise charges against him largely lost to time. The records of his kill count incomplete. He was not celebrated enough while alive for his crimes to be carefully preserved, and there is something chilling in that anonymity. The most efficient killers are often the ones history forgets. Number 11. Harvey Logan, Kid Curry. Harvey Logan was described by Pinkerton agents as the most dangerous member of Butch Cassidy's wild bunch. Not Cassidy himself, not the Sundance Kid. Kid Curry. Logan grew up in Kentucky, lost both parents young, and drifted west with nothing left to lose. He killed his first man in Montana in 1894. After that, the killings came with increasing regularity. What made Logan different was his willingness to kill lawmen, something most outlaws tried to avoid, because of the retribution it invited. Logan did not care. He killed at least 2 sheriffs, each time turning a local crime into a federal manhunt. His defining moment was his escape from the Knoxville jail in 1902. He fashioned a rope from wire, overpowered a guard, and vanished. His death is officially recorded as a suicide in 1904, cornered by a posse, wounded. He reportedly shot himself rather than surrender, but the body identified as Logan's was never conclusively proven to be him. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid get the movies. Kid Curry got the body count. Number 10. Johnny Ringo. There is something about Johnny Ringo that history has never quite been able to explain. He was educated. He could quote classical literature, genuinely intelligent, a rarity in the outlaw world. And yet he was drawn to violence with an appetite that intelligence could never quiet. He fell in with the cowboys in Arizona Territory and became a cold, intimidating presence. The outlaw who didn't need to shout because everyone in the room already knew. His defining confrontation is the face-off with Doc Holliday in 1882. 2 of the most dangerous men in Arizona, standing in the street, and neither one pulled a trigger. In July of that same year, Ringo was found dead beneath an oak tree in the Dragoon Mountains, a bullet through his skull. His boots were off. His pistol was in his hand. Wyatt Earp later claimed he shot him. Doc Holliday is another suspect. Others say it was suicide. Nobody knows. And the oak tree has long since stopped talking. Number 9. The Sundance Kid. Harry Longabore earned his nickname in the most unglamorous way possible. He stole a horse in Sundance, Wyoming, got caught, spent 18 months in jail. Most men would call that rock bottom. Longabore called it an education. He became the shooting arm of the wild bunch, cool under pressure, fast, accurate, the one you didn't want looking at you when the guns came out. In 1901, he and Cassidy sailed to South America, tried to ranch legitimately, failed, and returned to robbery in Bolivia. The official record says both men were killed by Bolivian soldiers in San Vicente in 1908. But witnesses disagreed about whether the bodies were theirs. Etta Place, his companion, vanished from history entirely around the same time. Her fate, unknown. The legend of the Sundance Kid ends not with a confirmed death, but with a question mark. Number 8. Butch Cassidy. Robert Leroy Parker was, by every account, genuinely likeable, charming, funny, a natural leader who kept his gang together through loyalty rather than fear. The Pinkertons wrote that Cassidy preferred robbery to violence, that he would go out of his way to avoid killing. But that charm obscures something important. Butch Cassidy built and led the most successful train robbing operation in American history. The Wild Bunch hit Union Pacific repeatedly, disappearing into the hole-in-the-wall country of Wyoming that law enforcement spent years trying to map. The defining heist was the Wilcox robbery of 1899. They blew the mail car with explosives and escaped with up to $60,000. As for his death, his sister claimed in a 1975 book that Cassidy returned to the United States and lived quietly under another name until the 1930s, that she had dinner with him. The grave in San Vicente was never proven to be his. Some legends refuse to end. Butch Cassidy is one of them. Number 7, Billy the Kid. He was 21 years old when he died. By his own count, he had killed 21 men, one for each year of his life. The documented number is closer to 8. William McCarty arrived in Lincoln County, New Mexico as a teenager. No money, no family, no plan. He found work with a rancher named John Tunstall, a man who showed him something resembling kindness. When Tunstall was murdered in 1878, Billy went to war. The Lincoln County War lasted months, killed dozens, and in those months, Billy transformed from a wayward teenager into a genuine gunfighter. Fast, accurate, utterly calm under fire, in a way that unnerved men twice his age. What history softens is how he escaped jail the second time. He killed 2 deputies with his bare hands and a borrowed gun. Pat Garrett found him in the dark at Fort Sumner in July 1881, shot him dead before a word was spoken. 21 years old. From here, the violence stops being about survival. From here, it becomes something colder. Number 6, Jesse James. Here is the version they don't usually lead with. Jesse James was a former Confederate guerrilla who rode with men who committed massacres, who killed unarmed prisoners, who burned towns. Jesse participated. He was 17, and already shaped by a level of violence that the Civil War had made routine. After the war, he turned those skills toward banks and trains. The James Younger gang operated for 15 years, stealing the equivalent of millions across multiple states. His defining failure is the Northfield, Minnesota raid of 1876. Citizens fought back. 3 gang members were killed in the streets. The younger brothers were captured. Jesse escaped by abandoning them. The twist in Jesse's story is not his death. It is the myth built around him. Sympathetic newspapers turned him into a Robin Hood. He gave nothing to the poor. He was a former racial terrorist turned career criminal. The myth was constructed for him, and it outlasted the truth. Robert Ford shot him in the back of the head on April 3, 1882, while he was straightening a picture on the wall of his own home. He never saw it coming. Number 5, Doc Holliday. By the time John Henry Holliday arrived in Tombstone, he was already dying. Tuberculosis had been working through his lungs for years. His doctors sent him west for the dry air. Holliday went west and found that while the air helped his lungs, it did nothing for his temper. He had trained as a dentist, graduated with honours, had a future. Then the diagnosis came, and with it a man with nothing to lose. He killed men in Dallas, in Dodge City, in Tombstone, thin, coughing, perpetually ill, and permanently dangerous. He stood with the Earps at the OK Corral on October 26, 1881. 30 seconds, 3 men dead. He walked in with a borrowed shotgun after everything. The gunfights, the manhunts, the bodies. Doc Holliday died in bed in a sanitarium in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He looked down at his bare feet and said, "Well, I'll be damned." He had always expected to die with his boots on. He was 36 years old. Number 4. Tom Horn. Tom Horn was not quite an outlaw. He was something the frontier invented for its ugliest work, a professional killer wearing a lawman's face. Horn was a former Army scout. He had ridden with General Crook during the Apache Wars, helped track Geronimo. When the Army finished with him, the cattle barons hired him, and what they hired him to do was murder. He worked quietly, with a rifle and a signature, a small rock placed under the head of each victim. His advertisement, his defining crime was the 1901 killing of 14-year-old Willie Nickel, shot from ambush near his father's homestead. The boy was wearing his father's coat. Horn killed him by mistake. The arrest came when a Pinkerton agent named Joe LaForce got Horn drunk and recorded his near confession in shorthand from an adjacent room. He was hanged in Cheyenne, Wyoming. November 20th, 1903. He reportedly helped design the gallows that killed him. Now, before we reach number 3, understand something. Every gunslinger before this point killed for revenge, profit, survival. The two men coming next killed for reasons even history struggles to explain, and that is what makes them different. Number 3. Wild Bill Hickok. James Butler. Hickok became a legend before most men his age had earned a reputation. He served as a scout during the Civil War and arrived in the cattle towns of Kansas already carrying the kind of stillness that dangerous men carry. He was tall, pale-eyed, and almost preternaturally calm under pressure. In Abilene, in Hays City, he served as marshal and left bodies behind him. His defining gunfight was the confrontation with Davis Tutt in Springfield, Missouri. 1865, 75 yards apart. Both men drew at the same moment. Tutt missed. Hickok did not. It is considered the first true quick-draw duel in recorded American history. The twist in Hickok's story is what he feared most. By the early 1870s, his eyesight was failing. He knew it, and he knew what it meant for a man in his profession. He began sitting with his back to walls, watching every door. On August 2nd, 1876, he sat down at a poker table in Deadwood, South Dakota. For the first time in years, he took a seat with his back to the room. Jack McCall walked in behind him and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok was holding a pair of aces and a pair of eights, a hand still called the dead man's hand. He was 39 years old. Number 2, Dallas Staudenmeier. He was a lawman in El Paso, Texas, in 1881. And in his first 4 days on the job, he killed 4 men. 4 men, 4 days. Staudenmeier had served in the Confederate Army, rode as a Texas Ranger, and arrived in El Paso when the town was a pressure cooker of gang interests, cross-border crime, and barely contained violence. On April 14, 1881, his 4th day as marshal, a confrontation erupted in the street. It was over before most people understood it had started. 3 men died. Staudenmeier shot 2 of them himself. In the open street, in broad daylight, his speed was the subject of cold, observed testimony from multiple witnesses who agreed on one thing. By the time most men cleared leather, Dallas Staudenmeier had already fired. His feuds multiplied. His drinking got worse. He was ambushed in September 1882. Shot multiple times, and reportedly still fighting when he went down. He killed more men in a shorter span than almost anyone on this list, and history handed the fame to others, which brings us, at last, to number 1. Number 1, John Wesley Hardin. There has never been anyone quite like him. John Wesley Hardin was born in 1853 in Bonham, Texas, the son of a Methodist preacher, named after the founder of Methodism. What his father got was something else entirely. Hardin killed his first man at 15. When the state of Texas sent soldiers to arrest him, he killed 3 of them. He was 16 years old. What followed was one of the most staggering careers of violence in American history. By documented record, he killed at least 40 men. He killed lawmen, cowboys, gamblers. He killed in Texas, Kansas, Florida. He killed for insults, real and perceived. And on one occasion, reportedly through a hotel wall because a man in the next room was snoring. His defining confrontation came in Abilene, Kansas, in 1871, where he stood down Wild Bill Hickok himself, using a technique called the road agent spin, presenting the pistol as if surrendering it, reversing it, and pointing it at Hickok's face. Whether Hickok was fooled or simply chose to let him walk, no one agreed. What is not disputed? Hardin left Abilene alive. He was captured in 1877, taken by Texas Rangers who knew better than to give him a chance to draw. He served 16 years, studied law, passed the Texas bar exam, opened a law practice. And here is the twist. Even then, he could not stop. He returned to drinking, to gambling, to the same violent arguments that had shaped every chapter of his life. On the night of August 19th, 1895, Hardin stood at the Acme Saloon bar, rolling dice by himself. A constable named John Selman walked in behind him and shot him in the back of the head. Hardin dropped without a sound, dead before he hit the floor. He was 42 years old. By many historical accounts, he may have been the deadliest individual gunfighter the frontier ever produced. A preacher's son, a lawyer, a man who could quote scripture, and who spent 30 years making sure other men never spoke again. John Wesley Hardin, number 1. And the next time someone calls the Old West romantic, remember the 40 men who never got to call it anything. 15 names, 15 lives, built on a frontier that no longer exists, swallowed by railroads, law, and a world where disputes moved into courtrooms. They were not heroes. They were not simple villains. They were men and women caught in a window of time when the rules were still being written, and the fastest hand sometimes got to write them. That window closed. The legends did not. If you want to know who came closest to bringing Hardin to justice before Selman's bullet found him, that story is coming next. Stay tuned.